Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. If democracy begins in conversation, then we need to nurture a culture where ordinary people like us routinely talk about those things that help us understand each other, whether it's about climate, race, religion, gender, or politics. When we're trying to make sense of our city and the world we live in, every question comes with a set of assumptions about the nature of ourselves and our place in a larger world. The Conversation Lab provides a safe place to talk about some of those things. This program is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver. It's available on air and online on various platforms, and we appreciate the help of Vancouver's community groups. Dr. Kari Marie Norgaard is with us today, and Kari is an associate professor of sociology and environmental studies at the University of Oregon. She's an author and has published as well as taught in the areas of sociology, gender, environment, climate change, and race. One of her specialties is denial. Kari even wrote a book about it, Living in Denial, Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life. Another specialty of Kari is working with indigenous groups such as the Karuk Tribe. The Karuk are an indigenous people of California. You know, it's probably a great place to start with a question is, how did you find this line of work?
Yeah, that is an interesting story. So I thought I was going to be starting a different research project for my dissertation back in the day, and I was teaching classes on environmental issues, and I noticed that some of my students were, keenly engaging with the material, and others had their eyes looking pretty glazed. And actually, it was one of my students who was really upset about this, and said, "How come people aren't responding more?" That really got me thinking about it. And around that time, I came across also the work of a Buddhist philosopher named Joanna Macy, who's written some about how people deal with disturbing information, and that got the ball rolling very quickly at that point. And I, as a sociologist, I began reading a lot of other people's work that are thinking about social structure and how that plays in, and went on from there.
I'm curious how the psychology works into sociology. What's the interconnectedness there?
Yeah. Well, most people, when they think of denial, they think of denial in more psychological or individual terms. And psychologists have done really important work in this area, and in particular, the idea of cognitive dissonance is extremely one of the most powerful theories in sociology, the idea that people can't really hold two conflicting thoughts in their heads at the same time. And I, as a sociologist, am very interested in individual experience, but what I do is situate what it is that people feel that they find disturbing, and both what they do once they're in that situation in a social context, in a context both of cultural norms and norms around emotions, and also in the context of our political economy, of what it means to be living in a country, and when it comes to climate change, where we are a very large historic and current contributor to fossil fuels, and a lot of these decisions are being made at the national level, and so this is sort of the context in which people might feel guilty. If you're living in Samoa or Fiji or somewhere where your nation doesn't really have the kind of carbon footprint the United States does, then or Canada, then it's the feeling of denial and what you might do would be very, very different if you have it at all.
Kari, I'm curious, and I just want to back up a little bit. Who is in denial? Are we all in denial to a certain extent? It's in some aspect of our lives. Are only some of us in denial about climate change or other big things in life? How do you compartmentalize, who the we is in this discussion?
That's a really great question, and I think at some level, and this is where there's been great psychological work done as well, at some level it is enormously difficult to think about climate change. And so, you could say that that it affects all of us to some degree, because similar to something like death, it's just so difficult to wrap our heads around the degree of change that we are facing and experiencing right now. That said, I think one of the things that's important to understand about the kind of work that I do is that I'm not interested in the climate skeptic movement, the so-called explicit denial. I draw on British sociologist Stanley Cohen's work on different typologies of denial. And the kind of denial that I'm interested in is more of the active ignoring, the ways that people who are aware that climate change is happening, believe that it's happening, but sort of continue to live our lives as though it isn't happening. And by that I mean not really taking it that seriously, not talking about it with friends, not planning our lives and thinking about our futures as though climate change might be a part of it.
That Ipsos Mori study that we've shared notes on that says that 47% of the people globally say that scientists don't know what they're talking about. I hope you're right that number is probably too high. But just in case it's not, I mean, not that the number matters, who are they? Is it still you and I, or is it somebody else?
Sure, I think that's true, and this is where, as a sociologist, it really matters. It's very easy, and this is something that folks on the right have, really critiqued the left for people, still using high carbon footprints and so forth. We all live in a social context, however, that is beyond our ability to immediately alter. And for that reason, at some level, sure, in order to go through our day, and this is, we need to be in denial. And this is where, as a sociologist, I think we need to think about it in this way. It's not that people are coming up out of the blue with the desire to get on an airplane. But furthermore, one of the things that's really important to understand is that part of the discourse that we have in the United States, and I'm sure to a great deal is true in Canada as well, although I can't give you as specifics, we have a very individualized discourse that doesn't think about social structure. So at this moment in time, certainly airline travel is a big part of the problem, and this is maybe one of the gifts of the Trump administration, is seeing how much it matters what's happening at the larger collective government level. We need to be making very large changes in carbon output and other greenhouse gases, and those changes are much larger than you or I deciding to get on and off an airplane. Those are about getting off coal. They're about rapidly bringing on other kinds of renewables. They're about putting in place systems that would allow us to shift, energy use on a very large scale. And I think that while it matters that people, as individuals, think about our transportation choices, what we most need to be doing now is exerting political pressure and making it very clear that we need to be thinking about large-scale changes in how we use energy.
One of the comments you made was the kind of denial that you do is about the active ignoring of information rather than those that don't believe that climate change is happening. Can you drill down a little bit in explaining those two differences? Because they seem very similar.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of attention paid to the very problematic reality that the way that science is understood in this country and worldwide, obviously I'm speaking from a U.S. context myself, but that belief in science is, science has had a founding role in the democratic project for a long time, and that there's definitely things that are shifting about that. There have been very active campaigns by the fossil fuel industry, enormous, as we are now, well documented, to create that sense of skepticism of the science. And for most people, most people actually do believe that climate change is happening, and for that community, there's a lot of attention being paid, sort of pointing the finger at the climate skeptics and saying, well, that's the real problem, rather than mobilizing our own collective power and taking responsibility. So I mentioned earlier Stanley Cohen's typology. He talks about explicit denial, which is saying climate change isn't happening. He also talks about interpretive denial, which is sort of maybe more along the lines of people say, well, it seems to be happening, but maybe it's not human-caused, or that kind of thing. And then implicatory denial, which is when you just sort of ignore what's going on, and that's kind of the elephant in the room, that you have to do some kind of gymnastics in a way to pretend not to notice what's happening, especially as information is more and more prevalent now.
You know, I guess the thing that I'm struck by is with so much scientific evidence, and you could cite multiple sources, probably hundreds of sources now over the last 25 to 50 years of how the universe or how our world has changed in particular. You know, how do you deny that? How do you ignore that?
I've approached this question sort of from a compassionate and critical angle at the same time. It's a huge collective problem that so many people in privileged democracies who presumably have some ability to affect change and some responsibility to stand up are not doing so. But on the other hand, the work I do is around disturbing emotions, the sense of fear about the future, the sense of helplessness that people express, and the sense of guilt. And so the compassionate angle of my approach is just in recognizing that these are very difficult and disturbing emotions. I don't know how many of your listeners have had that sort of middle of the night, oh my God, experience of, wow, we are really in for very serious times, and what is this going to mean for, for my life, for my children's life, for my community in the next 10 years? But those are not pleasant kinds of experiences to have, and so, I think that it is difficult to wrap our minds around it, and then at the same time, when you don't see other people being engaged, and we don't have a very rich discourse about what anyone can actually do, it is very expected that people would withdraw in this way.
What is denial's impact on social justice, just to break it down to a local community?
Great. Well, I think that this is an incredibly important dimension of things. So there's a term that's been circulating more, and that's the idea of environmental privilege. Some communities are somewhat protected from the worst of environmental harms, and of course there's also the idea of environmental justice or injustice, which is the struggles that other communities are facing where they disproportionately are experiencing environmental harms, and this has been a long-standing movement worldwide, and ideas of how when a disaster strikes, but also when long-term degradation is happening, that communities that are already targeted by racism, by sexism, classism, ways that colonialism and settler colonial states shape the ways that we experience something bad happens. And so environmental privilege and denial are connected in that if you believe that there is some possibility of affecting change and democracy, those who are somewhat sheltered from the immediate targeting from hurricanes or other longer time, slower unfolding kinds of environmental threats, have a responsibility to try to use that education and awareness that they have to create a better world. And when those of us who are in some position where we maybe are, not quite up against the wall with the onslaught in immediate lives, don't mobilize around climate change, then that is a very big problem. So denial, socially organized denial, which I'm working on, and the difficulty in sort of facing up to this is something that we see more in privileged communities where they have the option of ignoring